First of all, no, that's not compatible with the Bible, okay? Second of all, it's not compatible with science.
This is God's Word. You can believe it or not believe it, but you can't change it. And there is nothing in Genesis 1 or 2 that gives the least notion of evolution.
The bottom line is, no, if you just need shorthand, please hear me say, evolution is not compatible with Christianity, period. The more you understand Christianity, the more you understand evolution, you'll see the incompatibility.
Today, for any academics in the arena to even say anything like that is to risk completely being an outcast.
Give us some men who know the truth.
All right, so here we are, and we're tackling a big issue. The topic is evolution and creation. This has been a long-running topic, and today I have Jonathan Cross, who's going to be tackling. He is our speaker for this topic. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in biotechnology and evolution and ecology from UC Davis. He also received a Master's of Divinity degree from the Master's Seminary. And at UC Davis, he studied genes and gene expression, structure and function of biomolecules, animal biochemistry and metabolics, systematic physiology, ethics and science, molecular genetics, population genetics, philosophy of biology, phylogeny and macroevolution, and paleobiology, to just name a few. And don't feel bad if you don't understand those big words, because I don't either. But Jonathan, thank you so much for giving up your time and being with us today, sir.
My pleasure to be here. It's been a joy to be part of this process, and really looking forward to this, Justin.
Excellent. The way this went, I was blessed to have a professor who I will respectfully not mention the name of, to have a discussion, and he offered some the scientific worldview on this topic graciously. I am very grateful for that, and so we have basically broken down that email that he sent in response. And I'm just gonna first of all let everyone know. Here's what myself and the speaker are asserting. We believe that the Bible is the true Word of God. It is, we take it literally, we interpret it literally, and as it coincides with this topic, we believe in a 6-day literal creation. We believe that man was made in God's image, and we do not believe in naturalistic evolution, common ancestry, among others. And we're going to try and tackle those topics. First of all, right off the bat, I found it very interesting in the response from this professor. I sent an email to give him a point of reference of how to respond to us, because I asked him for questions or issues he might have with the creation stance and creation view, and to give him to know what to respond to. I basically asserted what I've already asserted in an email. And he replied graciously and dealt with those point by point, which was very helpful. And first of all, he actually, the first thing we want to deal with here is actually the fact of the topic of the debate itself. Okay. I asserted that there was an ongoing debate between evolution and creation, and he did take this to task. And so first of all here, Jonathan, what I asserted was that there is an ongoing debate, and he replied with a couple of things. And the first point here is that quote, there is no ongoing debate between evolution and creation in the scientific community. That debate only exists strictly in the religious community. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think in one sense, from one perspective, it's understandable what he says, because in my studies at UC Davis, for example, the entire faculty at in the evolution department for sure, and also the biology department in general, was completely on the side of naturalistic, materialistic, Darwinian evolution, or you might call neo-Darwinism, and the various offshoots of that. So in one sense, understandably, there is not a lot of debate or any debate at all in the secular circle of the university where he went, UCLA, myself, UC Davis. However, I would just gently recommend that he look at what is being done by scientists who are countercultural, so to speak. There's a lot been written. Just to name a few, let me just mention where you can go. If you're a listener today, you might check out some of these websites, for example, where scientists with doctorates in their respective fields, microbiology, biochemistry, just to name a few, have published articles and written books. Let me just mention a few sites. For example, you can go on the internet, check out Access Research Network. It's a premier site on intelligent design. Excellent articles and research done by Dr. Michael Behe, Dembski, Philip Johnson, and others. You could look at the research of Dr. Hugh Ross, looking more from a astronomy perspective, confirming intelligent design in the universe and enhancing the scientific case for God, the God of the Bible. His website is called Reasons to Believe. You might also check out some other sites like Dogmatic Materialism, an article by Philip Johnson, professor at UC Berkeley in the law department. He actually wrote a book called Darwin on Trial and other books, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds, just to name a couple. There's also quite a lot of books that you would want to read to look at the perspective of a creationist from a scientific perspective. A real simple one that's helpful is even material written by Ken Ham, the New Answers book, or by Henry Morris, The Biblical Basis for Modern Science.
Now, Jonathan, these gentlemen that you are citing here are not theologians. They are not pastors. These are scientists. These are men. Their education is in science. Their education, their background, and their careers is science. These are not pastors that have just read a couple of science books.
Well, these
are respected scientists in these fields.
Absolutely, but many of these are believers. Right. They are Christians, and some of these are both. Some of them do teach the Bible, but many of them, like Michael Behe, is a biochemist, and he writes from a purely biological and biochemical perspective, and you can read his book.
So some of them do venture are also theologians, but these are not men that are writing solely from like a pastoral stance or a theological stance. These are also respected scientists, or these are scientists in their field, highly scientifically educated individuals. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I recommend, just looking at what, like PhD William Dembski has an article called Intelligent Design is Not Optimal Design, demonstrating intelligent design doesn't require it to be optimal for it to be intelligent. There's articles, again, there's many articles on the websites that I mentioned here by Access Research Network. You can check it out. But there's also articles written by those, what we call the Young Earth Creationist site, which you could find a lot of their research. Over 30 scientists with ICR, which stands for Institute for Creation Research, and they're dedicated to research, publish, and teach those fields of science that are particularly relevant to the study of man's origins. I already mentioned Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis, both right. Also young earth creationists, unlike the intelligent design camp, which typically is an old earth. These are legitimate scientists. They do very good work, and unfortunately, they are marginalized and treated as non-scientists by the secular scientists in the evolutionary world.
So to nail down for this first point, basically what you're saying is on some level you do agree with this assertion that there is on some level not this ongoing debate between evolution and creation, in that a majority of the scientific community willingly accepts Darwinian evolution, natural selection, and offshoots of that. But there are scientists that do not accept it and have not just Bible verses and Bible backing, but also scientific research to support their belief in a creator. is basically there may not be an ongoing open book debate, but part of that is because of the marginalization. Part of that is because it's not allowed in one sense taught.
Well,
So the ongoing debate is not so. In a way, on the face of this reply, that is accurate, but it's not because that all scientists, legitimate scientists, accept it as truth. It's just that only the ones that are in our universities, a lot of they accept it, whereas other respected scientists don't.
Yeah, basically what you have is, like in my experience at UC Davis, if you maintain any sort of explanation for origins other than a naturalistic, materialistic, and therefore atheistic presupposition, you cannot teach. It is, in the words of a recent documentary, it is something you will be expelled for.
What I think is also interesting is I myself have been in touch personally with respected scientists. One gentleman basically ended up having to work as a truck driver and retired from that line of work because he could not get tenure. He was fired, and he's a respected scientist, one of the leading scientists in the area of reptiles and one of the foremost experts on specifically crocodiles. And he also has wrote a book with a friend of his who works at I believe a university in San Diego, and she had to use a surname out of fear of losing her job because of her assertion. So I think it is important that is mentioned, but also not just the last half here that the debate only exists strictly in the religious community. There is another individual that I think really throws a kink in that as well that I recently came across, and his name is Dr. David Berlinski. He is involved in the intelligent design movement. He is a fellow of the Discovery Institute, I believe. What's interesting is he is very open and says he is not a Christian or a fundamentalist. So I think it's important to cite that there are respected men in the science field and in other fields that do not buy into evolution, do not accept evolution as fact, and see a lot of errors in evolution, and they are not coming from any religious belief at all. He himself is an agnostic as far as the religious beliefs go, and I think that's very interesting that it is not only religious people that are rising up
not at all.
And denying this.
Not at all. And I would just say the literature that's being produced, the books and articles being published by the intelligent design community should be enough to satisfy any secular scientist, because they do not include biblical revelation in their work. Others do. Others that are like ICR and other groups will look at the scriptures as part of their framework. And we're going to get into that a little bit later as the difference is. But I just want to say this. True science, True science explains what we see in nature. And evolution, of course, speculates about what supposedly happened billions of years ago, millions of years ago. They look at the physical world, they look at DNA, they look at fossils, and they speculate about how it all became life from stardust or from some inanimate object. And not only that, they also begin with the assumption that somehow everything that is came to be from nothing, which is, as we'll probably mention in a future podcast, a huge problem for the law of thermodynamics, the first law that matter is neither created nor destroyed.
Right.
But not only that, they are attempting to answer what is seen with these presuppositions. Now, creationism has its own set of presuppositions, of course, its own set of understandings, but I believe, and so do all the intelligent design and creationists, that it does a much better job explaining the physical world based upon the model we have. So this is an issue of model. Does an atheistic, materialistic model explain what we see, or does the model provided in Scripture explain what we see in nature? And I think the answer is obvious if you're willing to open up the debate and include
and look at both models, not just look at one model.
Absolutely, and that's simply what a professor, as we're talking about, professor from UCLA, is unwilling to do. Evolution is simply a theory about what supposedly happened millions of years ago, billions of years ago even. It is not science. It is a theory. It is speculation. No one was there. I was not there. You were not there. So the creationists has no eyewitness testimony, neither does the evolutionist. This is not science based upon repeatable experiments. You cannot be back in the original primordial soup to see the chemicals. No one was there, and therefore it is not something you can demonstrate by laboratory experience. Evolution in that sense is not science. I know that ruffles some feathers, but it is...
Now you're also saying, now, what some would assert, and we get into those assertions a little bit later, that that you cannot repeat creation in a lab either. So the assertion is that it also breaks down because we can't observe it or repeat it either.
Right.
So
Well,
you're saying that the same criteria that is given from the scientific community, evolution can't meet it any more than creation can. Is essentially...
Well, yeah,
you're saying?
I'm just saying there are presuppositions. Here's what the evolutionist does. Okay, for example, I took a class at UC Davis called macroevolution, and what we did is we tried to reproduce the mutations that were necessary for a whale to evolve a blowhole. Okay, so we got our computer heuristics, these computer programs that would then simulate mutations, and every so often, every few million mutations, there would be an advantageous mutation, and the computer would record that, and you simply had to acquire, I think it was about 3,000 mutations, specific mutations that would be required to develop a blowhole. And so we just take those numbers, crunch in the computer, and you wait and you simulate millions of years and see how long it takes for it to happen. The problem with that kind of so-called science is it is not true science because of the presuppositions that go into it. There is major presuppositions, such as the fact that you are not allowing for what we call deleterious or negative damaging mutations to occur, which would reverse any positive mutation that does occur. It would, in fact, destroy the organism. Mutations, as we're going to learn later, are not beneficial largely. 99% or more of them, actually 99.9% of them in observable mutations today, prove to be deleterious or negative. So anyway, what happens in the science class, macroevolution, is these computer programs are made, and the scientist sits back and says, look how easy it is. We could evolve a blowhole in 15 minutes if we just follow this computer program.
So what you're saying, Jonathan, and which also you've kind of already touched on our next point, I'll go ahead and read that now.
Yeah.
The professor goes on to assert, quote, scientists can make no conclusions regarding the existence of God or creation because those things lie outside of the physical realm and therefore cannot be tested scientifically. Only things which are testable and have the potential to be disproved are within the realm of science. Religion, God, creation, etc. cannot be tested scientifically and have no business in a science classroom, science textbook, or anything else having to do with science. So basically what you have given this example of the blowhole and other things is that this criteria that this professor is setting forth as a reason why creation does not belong in science, evolution fails this criteria as well. As you're saying, it cannot have the potential to be disproved, if I understood you correctly.
Right. Yeah, I would say I would basically agree in this with the professor's statement, and that is that religion, cannot be tested. God cannot be tested scientifically and has no business in the science classroom. That's true, but
I think it's really very key to point out here that I and yourself as well also believe that science does not answer everything either.
Right, and what the evolutionist has to be willing to admit is that evolution is not objective science. That's the problem. Both evolution and creationism are not without presuppositions, and that's what they're unwilling to bend, to the point that if you look at the definition of science, the very definition of science, as I studied in my one of the classes I took, was called the philosophy of biology. The very philosophy of all biology is evolution. The very foundation is materialistic and naturalistic evolution. So what we have then is we have a problem at the very starting point. And so this is what we need to deal with. We need to deal with the theory of evolution is based upon this, and I think it might be helpful just to mention a couple of things about the way evolution has come.
Before you do that, I wanted to say, are you saying that okay, I freely admit to having presuppositions. you yourself, I'm assuming, also admits to having presuppositions for your belief in God and creation. Is that correct?
Right.
And so we freely admit that, and most creationists and a lot of scientists freely admit that as well. So what you're saying is evolutionists, or people that believe in evolution, have presuppositions as well. They're just not willing to admit that they have presuppositions.
Well,
They're just trying to say that I'm coming as a blank slate, and then I'm just looking at the evidence, and after looking at the evidence, the only option is naturalistic evolution. And are you also saying that presuppositions are a good thing or a bad thing? Or can you expound a little bit on presuppositions, good or bad, and maybe why they're not admitting to having them or what stance they're taking?
Well, it's just not part of the discussion. The very definition of science, not just evolution, but the very definition of science is it must be explained naturally. So whatever you observe, whatever hypothesis you make, and then therefore you develop a test, an experiment, and you repeat the experiment, and you draw conclusions based upon that, that has to always leave God out of the equation. That's the definition they work with. And I'm just saying that definition is unfair because they have already concluded God is not a possibility. Therefore, creation will never even be an option.
So because they don't even consider creation as an option, it immediately stops being true, genuine science.
Yeah.
And you said because they don't offer, because as this professor said here, I'll back up here and read it again. Only things which are testable and have the potential to be disproved are within the realm of science. So for something to have the potential to be disproved, that has to be ascertained or at least considered an option. It has to at least be looked at and say this can be disproved.
Right.
And you're saying that that's true, but you're saying that evolutionists generally assert that there's no way it could be God, so they never even look at it as an option, and therefore they claim it to be disproved, and the very definition of science, that doesn't hold up to that.
Right, and that's how they're able to have basically a unanimous front in the realm of science with evolution as a philosophy of all science and all biology for sure, because there's no other option. Anything else would be considered, bad science to even have the possibility that there's intelligence. And to look for that. Let me just say a word about this evolutionary approach. It is based upon rationalism. It's a philosophy that suggests that the employment of procedures of reasoning will lead to historical knowledge about the earth. Under the philosophy of rationalism, the principal measure of a good geologic theory was not necessarily how it accorded with the present rates, process, natural laws, but rather how it formed to a logical portion of history. And what we see in evolution is this rationalist criticism of the biblical account of creation promoted by others before Charles Darwin, but also by Charles Darwin in his Origin of Species in 1859, and is Darwin's observations that natural selection was an inherent process of the biological world led him to propose a rationalistic evolutionary theory, supposing that all species had to develop from a few separate stocks. So this geology of the present century, this view of geology, has been dominated by this rationalistic evolutionary theory. And so geologists have recently labored with models for the evolution of the Earth's crust, suggesting that a single supercontinent broke away with fragments drifting to their present locations. And for several years, geologists have attempted to construct a plausible physical, chemical environment under which life could have spontaneously appeared from inorganic substances. But your mind begins stretched when you begin to imagine how these processes operating with extreme slowness over millions of years could have come to cause the changes we see now.
So are you saying, because you used rationalism, so
Right.
If we're talking about rationality or using looking at something rationally, are you saying that rationality, that they are stepping outside of what is rational, or that rationality is a bad thing? What exactly are you saying as far as rationality is concerned?
Well, yeah, rationalism is a naturalistic philosophy that says your mind, your understanding, can explain everything that is. You can eliminate God from the equation.
So basically, in a way, this is saying that science can answer, it has the answer to everything, or will
Yes.
eventually answer everything.
Right,
That you
exactly.
don't have to, that anything outside of the realm of science, like getting into the realm of theology, philosophy, anything like that, anything that cannot be answered within science is not, is nothing, is wrong.
Right, and what happens just in looking at the geology, which is looking at the Earth's crust and looking at the geological columns, what happens is this philosophy of evolution then begins to explain what we see in the Earth's crust, in the Earth's the geological columns, in a what's called uniformitarian way. It is because there is a presupposition that everything happened gradually over millions of years, and so this is the grid in which we look at everything to stretch it out over millions of years and imagine how it slowly occurred. But the empirical uniformity is now very popular, and this is the way in which it continues to promote this rationalistic evolutionary view, is by being committed to a uniformitarian view of change, slow gradualism, and that's what Darwin taught. He taught gradualism, and now there are major problems with that based upon the fossil record and the fact that we see species occur spontaneously, fully formed without transition, and that's caused some problems.
So this goes even further to say, because even people, evolutionists or whatever, admit that science has not, that we don't have all of the answers, obviously, but they presuppose that those answers will be found eventually in science, and they're saying that it is going to match up with the supposed evidence that they have now. So they're saying that anything that is outside the power of man and your own brain is nothing. There is nothing outside of that. Any assertion of any power outside of that is irrational by their claim, and therefore not scientific and not worth anything, does not hold any weight.
Yeah, and so the discussion never goes beyond their pre-commitments to the foundational pillars of Darwinian evolution, which is gradualism, although they had to modify this theory because of the lack of evidence. Let me just say what is creation science. We looked a little bit about evolution and what it holds to. Creation science and intelligent design, because they're really two different varieties of the same thing. Creationism can be studied and taught in basically three different ways. You can look at it as scientific creationism, which is really no reliance at all on biblical revelation and utilizes only scientific data to support and expound upon the creation model. Okay, that would be the kind of creationism we're suggesting should be free to be taught in school, because it does not rely upon the Bible. But in like manner to that, there is a group that labels their view as intelligent design, really specific to looking for intelligence.
And not necessarily naming the designer or naming
Right.
the intelligence.
Yeah, they would be much more careful to stay away from any particular religious affiliation, but they're just
Dr. David Berlinski that I mentioned earlier would be a
Right.
perfect example of that. He does not assert Christianity or fundamentalism. He does not assert God as creator, but he sees the idea. He does not also take on the belief that that we weren't created.
Right.
He's a part of the
He's
intelligent design.
Right.
He's open to the creator could have been any number of things, but he has a tendency to lean towards, based on the evidence that he has seen, to lean towards that we have a creator.
Absolutely.
Whoever he or she might be. Whereas creation nails down and say, here's who we believe the creator to be.
Yeah, well, I would say biblical creationism does that. This purely scientific creationism would not rely on the Bible. Biblical creationism would rely really on the Bible only, but a scientific biblical creationism would rely fully on the Bible and its revelation to man, but also would use scientific data. which is really where I have landed, because I believe the Bible and the science support each other, and that's of course what any the Christians would hold to, is that there's an agreement there. But the intelligent design camp really is a variety of scientific creationism without going beyond calling themselves intelligent design. And I just want to say a few words about intelligent design, because this is the camp that has threatened the evolutionary camp the most, and that hence the movie Expelled. Intelligent design basically holds that certain features of the universe and of the living things in the universe are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected process such as natural selection. So intelligent design is really it's a scientific disagreement with the core claim of evolutionary theory, and that which is that the apparent design of living systems is merely an illusion, which is what evolutionary thinking suggests. Just an illusion. We don't see design. That's just an appearance. So in a broader sense, intelligent design is simply science of design detection, how to recognize patterns arranged by intelligent cause for a purpose. So design detection is used in a number of scientific fields, not just intelligent design. It's used in anthropology. It's used in forensic sciences, seeking to determine the cause of a fire or a death. It's also used in the studies of extraterrestrial intelligence, again, looking for signs of design in outer space. But this inference that certain biological information may be the product of an intelligent cause simply is testable, and it can be evaluated in the same manner as scientists daily test for design in other sciences, like I mentioned.
Along the lines of that, I've heard leading evolutionists assert that they are open to, the possibility that there was maybe an alien race that seeded us here or whatever. And intelligent design is not nailing down and naming the creator. They're open to that as well, as opposed to, but they're just saying there is some intelligence in how we came to be. Whatever that intelligence is, there is intelligence here. So why do you feel that, do you think that people are threatened, the evolutionary world is threatened by intelligent design the most because they look at it as a Trojan horse that is ultimately going to get creation in there? Because if we're going to be fair all across the board and talk about all the theories that are out there, one of those would have to be creation. And then I guess my question is, why, if it's so debunked and if it carries no truth and no weight, then why not let it? Then why be afraid to share it?
Well, I think they're afraid because inside the heart of man, and we know that there is a knowledge, there is a sense of the divine, there is an understanding. Romans chapter 1 teaches us that. So what we have then is we have people who are suppressing that truth in their unrighteous attempt to deny God, who they don't want to have any authority or rule over their lives. And so there is really a subtle suppressing of that. They don't want that to enter into the equation.
So ultimately, they're threatened by creation. They're threatened by intelligent design because if we let intelligent design, we can't let intelligent design in, so to speak, to be taught without letting creation being a part of that. And it's ultimately the creation because, according to God in the Bible, they know they're suppressing the truth. Because they don't seem to be threatened by even, the teachings of the Muslims, or that even that there was a possible extraterrestrial race that seeded us here, but yet they do take great issue with creation, and in turn take issue with intelligent design because that would be the catalyst to get that in the classroom. And I'm saying if we're all about stepping back and looking at the evidence and looking at everything and then making a decision off of that, then why not share everything that's out there? And your reply to that, if I'm hearing you correctly, is to do that, they could not continue to suppress, which is what they're doing, which is suppressing the truth. So they're not as open to the evidence as they claim, essentially.
Right, but they do it in a very politically correct way by defining science as naturalistic. So they have that starting point, and so the very concept of design, they say that's unscientific to even begin there. So that's the problem. Let me just summarize here what it is that we're looking at here in the evolution model and the creation model. In its most simple form, evolution model is continuing naturalistic origin. It is the present increase in complexity overall, that is a net increase in complexity over time. And evolution model assumes the Earth's history was dominated by uniformitarianism, that is stasis or gradualistic uniformitarian history. The creation model, as
can you real quick? Can you break down a little bit more of what that uniformitarianism is? What exactly is that? Because you're saying that evolution asserts that the world was dominated by that. What is uniformitarianism?
Well,
expand a little bit, or kind of break it down a little bit more.
Darwin's theory was gradualism, that everything gradually evolved slowly over time. That the Earth has been here 4.5 billion years, the universe 15 billion years, and over those long eons of time, things were just gradually and consistently, without any interruption, without major changes, without any divine intervention, obviously, without any major changes. The laws of nature have continued the same throughout time. The laws of basic chaos theory, randomness, has allowed for random combinations to happen over and over and over and over. So the throwing of the dice is just happening long enough, and that, like I mentioned earlier, the Earth's crust was all one solid piece, and it just gradually shifted outward over time. The creation model is just the opposite. We know from the revelation that God has plainly told us that the Earth's history was dominated by catastrophe. So catastrophism is the idea that there has been major interventions. The creation of the world, for start, God created everything fully formed. He created starlight ready to go. In other words, Adam and Eve didn't have to wait for starlight to travel to planet Earth. There was light because God brought the light from the distant stars and from the sun, so that man could be in the daylight when He created light. God created the plants, and He created the trees fully formed. There was no doubt apples and oranges and all kinds of fruit ready to go on the day that Adam walked the earth. Adam was not created as an infant. He was created as a fully formed man. And that is not a gradual philosophy. That is a drastic intervention. And then on top of that, there has been very large catastrophes in history, the biggest of which is a global flood, which we're going to talk about later, does bring a huge explanation to what we see in the fossil record and explains our model better. But not only is there a difference in the Earth history being dominated by catastrophe, but also we of course believe in a supernatural origin. We also believe in a net decrease in complexity and decrease in organization, or what we might call an increase in entropy, which is a law of science that evolutionists don't like to talk a lot about, but it actually is one of the strongest arguments against evolution. That is the second law of thermodynamics, that all systems tend towards disorder. In other words, all energy is tending toward useless heat, so that all processes, so
that we're gradually getting destroyed, not gradually improving.
Absolutely. And what's ironic is that's a law of science. It's a law of thermodynamics.
That is accepted all across the board as
absolutely. Okay. But they have tricky little ways to try to explain how that law could be temporarily bypassed in a closed system. And so they go around that, but that would be worthy of a whole podcast. We should talk about that, because this is something that really is a huge problem that is not fairly dealt with, for the fact that flowing jet or a car left to itself is going to rust, it's going to wear out, it's going to become useless.
It's not going to become a more efficient thing in
Right.
a million years.
Right, and as we're going to see a little bit later, no amount of natural selection and mutation is going to bring about a increase in complexity and information, but rather mutation, because of this law, will always tend towards disorder. So they've got a huge problem. They're trying to climb a mountain, going against gravity, and all of science points against that. Of what we can see today. So this is what we have now. Creationists are not advocating the teaching of the Bible in the classroom. All we're suggesting is that it should be legal and desirable to allow scientific creationism to be taught in the public schools as a valid alternative to evolutionism.
So real quick before we go on to our final point under this heading of the opinion on the evolution versus creation, the actual debate, just to summarize here. You do agree that there is no ongoing debate between evolution and creation, but that is because most of the people in the secular, in the secular science realm, be it scholastic or whatever, agree, and a lot of the creation science is just not allowed in, or they really just don't have a meeting of the mind, so to speak, and so it in a way that is accurate. There is not that ongoing debate,
Right.
but it's not because true scientists and true science shows evolution. True scientists have declare evolution to be fact, but just some do, and then the ones that don't just are kind of not paid attention to.
Yeah,
Okay?
it's very it's very sad. When I was at UC Davis, I actually got a bachelor's degree in evolution as well as a bachelor's degree in biotechnology, and so I did that just so I could understand firsthand what was coming out of the mouth of the professor and interact with it. I then would go out into the courtyard and I would speak to people about the Bible. And one day I was handing out little booklets to the students, and one of the young ladies in our class, I was actually in population genetics, which is a very very difficult class. It had to do with just the mathematical formulas that are used to calculate how much genetic change has to happen before a species becomes its own species. And so we were doing all these calculations, and I left class and went out to hand out some booklets about the Bible. And out came this young lady, and she looked at me. She looked at the booklet, and she could not figure out how in the world I could be there holding out a booklet on the Bible. Just for her was absolutely was ludicrous. It was an oxymoron. It was like water and oil mixed together. And so she just couldn't. She didn't have anything to say. She just looked at me and she said, "How can you?" And she just was stunned. And that's really what goes on. I mean, it is that opposed. It is that diametrical, the response from the evolutionary circle.
So, and then the next point, just to kind of summarize, that scientists can make no conclusions regarding the existence of God or creation because those things lie outside of the physical realm and therefore cannot be tested scientifically. Some things we touched on was that creation does not lie outside of the physical realm and therefore cannot be tested scientifically, and that God, religion, theology, things like that do. But we also do not assert that science answers all questions. And then you went on to say that in reply to only things which are testable and have the potential to be disproved are within the realm of science. But evolution, you say, fails that criteria as well because they don't even ascertain. They go in with the presupposition that it's true and that it's fact.
Yeah,
and even ascertain any other options that it might not be.
Right, and
there that you're saying.
Yeah, and the so-called experiments that they're doing are not based upon conditions at the early Earth. They're speculating with computer models and with laboratory, which I'll talk about later. In the lab, they're trying to reproduce mutations and evolve, as we did in my class, fruit flies into new species. But all that by using the intelligence of the grad students in the laboratory to guide and to manipulate evolution, as it were, which really is a better argument for intelligent design than evolution. But this is the problem. They're not they're not willing to set aside all of these presuppositions, and they're trying to do what's really non-science.
See,
And-
I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to be. But that right there, the scenario you just gave, it's like to me, it's right in front of their face because, like you said, these are people in a lab putting this stuff together and then trying to cause it to happen. But what are those people putting this stuff together? They're intelligent beings. They're thinking beings. So even to reconstruct this stuff requires intelligence. It's not like they're just. These labs are not just areas. They're not observation only. They're not in there just sitting there. They're actively involved.
Oh yeah, we're taking
and so that to me, and then again, maybe I'm not smart enough, but that to me says you're sitting there claiming that you're proving evolution true by using the process of intelligent design because you are intelligence designing it.
Well, it was interesting, and this is maybe a good way to end this last question, and we can move on to another topic. But when I spent 6 months in the lab working under the professor, the evolution professor, and he had me working with fruit flies, and we were basically taking the DNA of a fruit fly, Drosophilus is the scientific name, and we would take that DNA and cut it open with enzymes and insert the DNA from a E. coli bacteria, which had on it something called a transposon, which would cause the DNA from the fruit fly to spontaneously open itself up and move around. And by doing that, it would then cause mutations to occur at a very fast rate. And that would, for some of the flies, cause them to change a very important feature, which is the location of little hairs on the legs of the fly, which are called the sex comb. And the sex comb then allows a certain kind of a fly to mate with another of its same species. And so if you were to put this DNA in and cause it to transpose, you could in fact create a new species of fruit fly, which simply would be one with different hairs on its legs so that it would not mate with its previous species and would then speciate. Well, speciation is a definition of very big definition of evolution, is causing new species to exist. So they were very proud of themselves. Unfortunately, it didn't actually happen during my 6 months. We tried and tried and tried to get this to happen, but
that's the interesting thing. Again, for me, is that intelligence cut the fly open. Intelligence inserted this DNA.
Right.
They didn't just sit there and watch it happen, and then those mutations occurred. The new species. Well, I mean, you said it didn't. It never actually was successful. But without intelligence taking that step, even if it was successful, the intelligence was required.
Right.
I think that's important to note.
Yeah.
But we can go ahead and move on to the next point, which is this is the final point under this heading of the actual debate, which is for scientists there is either evidence to support evolution or evidence to refute it. At present, there is overwhelming evidence to support it. What is this evidence, John?
well, this is where I'd like to start with this. This is a rather large claim that the professor is making. So let me just share a few things. Let me just explain first of all what we know about natural selection and what we know about evolution. Okay, basically, scientists and authors use the term evolution to mean, first of all, change in features over time, but they also use it to mean the history of life on the earth. And it's difficult to know then which definition is being used in each instance. Once you read the science books, you'll notice that. And so this often is used as sort of a bait and switch technique. And so when small changes arise as a result of loss of information, and this is then used as evidence for evolution. This is a switch. And so what you have then is you have these simple definitions that can be used to kind of to trick people into thinking that evolution has occurred. So let me just go ahead and explain to you a little bit about what really we know about natural selection. Natural selection can be defined as a process by which individuals possessing a set of traits that confer a survival advantage in a given environment, that they tend to leave more offspring on average to survive in the next generation. So it's a process of passing on traits because of an advantage, and they are selected to live. In the case of the fruit fly, it would be if the sex comb, the little hairs on the legs, are fully developed, then that species will be able to breed and therefore pass on its genes to the next generation, and obviously will proliferate more likely. Now, it's an observable process. It is a process that falls into the category of operational science. It is an observable process, and we have observed mosquitoes, for example, birds, and many microorganisms undergoing change in a relatively short period of time. That's not debated at all. In fact, new species have been observed to arise. I mentioned the fruit fly. This has happened, and it's not something that it would surprise anybody. But the biblical creationists agree with the evolutionists on most of the ideas associated with natural selection, except the idea that natural selection leads to what we call molecules to man evolution. This is like a leap into the darkness. This is not anything substantiated, but rather an extrapolation into millennia of open space. There is nothing to go that far, but that's what they conclude. So we can start with something we can agree upon, but they jump to a conclusion of molecules to man evolution.
Do you agree that there are changes within species, but there is no evidence supporting species to species changes, especially non-human species to human species? There's no evidence to support that.
Well, I mean, certainly there's no evidence of ape men that we have never found a half man, half ape. But even beyond that, the fossil record is absolutely replete with the kinds of transitions we need, whether it be from bacteria to jellyfish, or from fish to amphibians, or from reptiles to birds, and all the way up from primates to man. There is not the gradual transitional species that we need to see. It's purely speculation that it happened. What we do agree, however, is there can be speciation, and we have seen that with bacteria. There are things you can do to fruit flies to cause them to speciate, and even Darwin's finches that he noticed were because of their geographical location, they were separated on different islands, and they would then become basically a species because of their separation through geographical location. A species just simply means that which interbreeds, that which is able to interbreed, and if something is not able to interbreed, then it is not the same species. Now, this brings up this whole issue of speciation.
Like, I know that one examples would be ligers.
Right.
Lion and tiger breed, but they're also in the same species. They're both, cat species, or I don't know what the scientific name is. But there never was a lion wolf. That
right.
We know of. There's no, or another one is what the mule.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the lions. The scientific name is Panthera leo, and for tigers it's Panthera tigris. And it's interesting because this issue of speciation is observable and fits into the category of operational science, of genuine science. Speciation has been observed to turn one kind of animal. Has not been observed rather to turn one kind of animal into another kind of animal. What we do have, however, is, like you said, lions and tigers, both members of the cat family. In the Bible, by the way, it says that God created each animal to reproduce after its own kind. So what we have then, the Christian creation model very simply explains this, that God created a cat. Basically, the two species of lions and tigers were from an original species of cat. It's from that we have digressed, not evolved upward, but we have digressed from the genome of that original cat. We have two kinds of cats, lions and tigers, members of the cat family, and that is basically different species due to geographic location. They've separated over time, and they begin to become their own species now. And you can, however, you can mate a lion and a tiger, and they call them ligers. That's a male lion and a female tiger, and you can also get a tigon, which is a male tiger and a female lion. Both can be produced, of course, varying degrees of fertility as a result. It's interesting. We can see that because that's all permissible within the genome of the original kind. That's no problem. See,
they're all cats. There's never
cats.
a time, just like what is it? The mule is a horse, and the offspring of horse and donkey.
Yes,
but
right.
they're still
they're
in
sterile.
the same. They're
they're
but
sterile.
They're still. It's not a horse and a cow. There's no evidence, and there's nothing that claims that at one point they had a like species. So these are not evidences of jumping species. This is just a continued assertion of Genesis, or affirmation of Genesis' claim, or of God's command of, I have created all things to produce after its own kind, because they are still cat kind, horse kind, whatever.
And this is a good picture of the creation model fitting the data much better, because our explanation explains what we see much better than the evolutionists. We see that because when God created the genetics of that first cat, they were perfect. They had no errors, no mutations. It's through the result, by the way, of sin entering the world that disease and death entered, and because of that, mutations have occurred, and we have defects. And over time, they have produced separate species, largely because of geographical separation. And that's exactly what we see today, and that's why you can interbreed them, because they are originally from the same kind.
Or I guess a different question would be: is it a scientific conclusion to draw on this or any other area that just because we don't know yet means that it is evolution? Is that a scientific position to take, or does that break down? And if so, how does that break down? Basically saying, well, we just haven't found it yet, but the evidence points that it's out there.
Well, there's a lot of so-called transitional species that you would expect to find, and that are not in the fossil record, and which fits perfectly with the creation model that God created: fully formed cats, fully formed dogs, fully formed cattle, fully formed primates, fish, birds, etc. And the lack of those transitions, the lack of a transition between a bird and a reptile, or between fish and an amphibian, or between, for that matter, between man and ape, is a huge problem. But what evolution has done is they have come up with new theories, like popularized by Stephen Jay Gould, punctuated equilibrium. That is to say, equilibrium or stasis for thousands, millions, and millions of years, punctuated by all of a sudden a change that happened so quickly that the fossil record didn't have time to record the fossilization of the transitions, and so what you have all of a sudden punctuation of a new species.
How is that nothing more than I don't mean to be mean here, but how is that nothing more than just a ridiculous guess? Because it sounds to me, and of course I'm a Christian, so I'm not unbiased, but it sounds to me, like you said, that goes back to the presuppositions. I don't want God. I don't want the truth. So I've got to figure out a way to explain it another way, and going down to saying, well, there was something happened quickly after millions of years of gradual stasis, then something quickly happened, which we don't know, and the fossil record skipped over, was not able to record the transitions. We lost the transition there, or at least we haven't found them yet. And then now we have the fully formed. So basically, we just skipped nature. The history of nature skipped over that because they were taken off guard by something quickly that happened. Now,
Right.
is there any type of evidence or any type of truly scientific explanation that supports that? Is it anything more than just a guess to fit the presuppositions of not wanting there to be a God?
Well, yeah, it's for them. The scientists will tell you that they have plenty of transitional species. They would say, "Oh, we have a lot. We have all these different kinds of fishes, and we have some fish that they can survive a little bit out of water, and other fishes that you have amphibians that can go in and out of the water, and we have
I can go in and out of the water,
right,
but I'm human when I'm in there, and I'm human when I'm not.
right."
And I know that sounds
that's the
funny,
problem,
but
is
I mean,
it's
to
an
me-
issue. It's an issue of how many transitions do you need to legitimately explain. So the creationist says, well, when God created, He created fish, He created amphibians, He created reptiles, He created birds, and they say, well, where are the transitions between all these? And the evolution says they are the transitions. We just got a few. We just got a few of them. And so this is how they can be convinced of it, that they're glad they got what they have, and they really believe that the fossilization process was unable to capture. And it's true, fossilization does not occur all the time. Something has to be buried rapidly, and it has to be buried in such a way that the bone will be replaced by minerals in the earth. And if it's eaten by scavengers, or if the sun is rotting it, or whatever, then, or if it's not rapidly buried, then yes, then things won't be preserved. So they basically fall back on that as an explanation. But let me just move on to...
They fall back on, if you could they fall back on what as an explanation?
On
that the fossils that we have are the transitions.
Well, that, and also that it is quite difficult to fossilize something unless it's buried rapidly and the right conditions exist. So they just say, well, the right conditions weren't there at that time. It's sort of a theory of gaps. So we don't have anything because there was no fossilization occurring at that time in history. Of course, the creationists would as we're going to learn later, it would explain a lot of what we see quite well with their model of a global flood. But moving on to this basic question we're dealing with here is the issue of...
At present, there is overwhelming evidence to support evolution.
Yeah, so the overwhelming evidence. Let's continue on looking at that for the remainder of our time. And this issue of adaptation. Let me just say a few words about adaptation. Adaptation is a physical trait or behavior due to an inherited characteristic that gives an organism the ability to survive in a given environment. Okay, now evolutionists look at a characteristic of an organism, and they assume that it was produced through a gradual series of changes, and they call that an adaptation to a given environment. So to an evolutionist, legs on a tetrapod are an adaptation that arose as the fish, we call a fish a tetrapod that has 4 fins. As the tetrapod arose, buds from the fish's fins and began to crawl on, in the shallow stream, providing some form of advantage. And then the fins with these bones became, they survived through natural selection, became better adapted to life on a sort of land-water environment. And those fins developed bones that eventually were able to attach to a pectoral girdle, which is a whole other set of bones that somehow had to develop. And this then gave the advantage for the tetrapod, those individuals, to go in and out of the water, to find food, to survive. And the problems with this scenario are the amount of time that such a change would require and the lack of a mechanism to cause that change. Of course, evolutionary biologists assume, based upon geologic interpretations, that there have been billions of years for this process to occur. This is a very interesting point. Everything seems plausible if you just give it enough time. This is sort of the catch-all way of explaining everything. Well, you just give anything enough time and your imagination can see that, well, yes, keep throwing the dice, keep rolling the dice, and eventually you'll get the right combination. And you just keep trying and trying again. So what is impossible biologically seems possible if you just give it billions of years. And that is the deception of evolution. That is the deceptive nature of the theory of evolution.
So if that's the case, then how do they deal with because like you said, even like with the plane and the car scenario that we brought up earlier of that's going to rust, that's going to, if left by itself, it's just going to slowly move closer to destruction and just rust and rot, and it's not going to improve. You and I, humans, as we age, we're moving towards death. It's like the old saying, you start dying the moment you're born. How do they? And I don't see any evidence that we're more efficient, that I'm more efficient than my say my grandparents or my great grandparents or people that lived hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. That I am a better human body, that I am a better equipped human body, at least on my own, at least without intelligence of medical advances helping me. Again, intelligence, but there's nothing that points to that I am a more efficient being over time. Anything that makes me more efficient and me more able to deal with disease, to protect myself comes from intelligence. We have weapons to protect ourselves from intelligence. We have medical advances come from intelligence. So how do they deal with that? That nothing shows that any improvements have been no improvements that have come about apart from some form of intelligence in any area.
Well, again, it goes back to the theory, the mechanism. Their mechanism is natural selection. So they believe that random mutation will produce enough beneficial mutations that the beneficial ones will select and will be able to adapt and survive, and those will be selected for. And so the illustration, as you mentioned, of entropy or the decay of an airplane, they would say, well, that's not a problem because animals are not, or plants are not airplanes. They have a mechanism for selection. They have a survival. They can increase. That is the fault of denying what is true not only with airplanes, it's true for living organisms, is that DNA mutations are tending towards disorder. Life tends towards the same law of entropy, and just as it would an airplane, all energy tends towards wasteful, useless energy. All life tends towards death, tends towards mutation and downward spiral. So,
now, what if because I've recently heard the assertion that yes, it is designed, yes, it is guided, but the designer is evolution. The designer is the selector or natural selection. This process, that's why you see order. That's why you see design, is because you basically what you're viewing is not God's order. You're viewing a selection process. That's why you see order. It's like you said, this move towards wasteful energy, unless there's an interjection. They say the interjection is selection. So that there is a guiding light there, which is natural selection. Right. But then again, the question that I ask is, how can it's not an intelligent being. How can a process guide anything on its own?
Right. Well, that really is the problem. Is you need intelligence to guide something to be productive, to the point to go against the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics.
Because it is a process. Natural selection is it's not a. It is not a being. It is not a.
Right. It's not an intelligent.
Animal. It's not an intelligent being. It's not. I mean, and there's no process that I know of. Be it from doing your taxes to changing oil in your car to birth, there is no process, a set of laws that did not have to be put in motion or does not have to be guided by some form of intelligence.
Right.
Okay.
So what they have is they believe, of course, that DNA does that. So it's a sort of chicken and the egg. What came first? Well, you had to get DNA to guide that. Of course, DNA does regulate all cell function and regulate cell.
So DNA, according to them, is the intelligence that guides natural selection.
Right.
DNA basically says, okay, these are the strong traits, these are the traits that need to be continued on, so we select this, or whatever. I know I'm butchering this again, I'm not a scientist, but DNA is basically the intelligence that and it uses natural selection to decide what continues on. And so then when we have people that are mentally challenged, that are crippled, is that just mistakes because DNA is not perfect?
Well, yeah, those are examples of mutations. Again, that's the tendency of all mutation is to create a negative or deleterious mutation. And so what the evolutionist is supposing is that not only would there be natural selection, but they have to add to the mechanism of natural selection. They have to add new genetic information, which is really what the intelligent design camp is trying to point out is you need intelligence added, you need information added to allow for natural selection. Let me explain.
And so saying that natural selection as the designer doesn't hold up because natural selection does not have intelligence.
No, it's
it
not
cannot
intelligent.
work without intelligence.
No, not.
Okay.
It needs information. In other
It
words,
needs information.
It needs genetic information. Let me illustrate. To produce the new bones in the fins of this tetrapod requires an elaborate orchestration of biological processes. The bones don't just have to be present. They must develop at the right time in the embryo, and they have to have their shape and their size, of course, predetermined by the DNA sequence. They have to be attached to the correct tendons, ligaments, blood vessels. They have to attach to the bones of the pectoral girdle, and so on. So the amount of information required for this seemingly simple transformation is not provided by a process that generally deletes information from the genome. Now, that's the problem. Is there is no process available to give all that information to create all those new characteristics at the same time, which is a whole other issue we call irreducible complexity. I'm not going to get into it now, but there is a tremendous amount of complexity to just make tetrapod, a walking fish, is a tremendous amount of genetic information. So now biblical creationists consider major structures to be part of the original design. Okay, this is all put in the DNA originally. So all the DNA necessary for an amphibian, let's say a newt or some sort of amphibious creature, is there in the DNA originally. Modifications, of course, to those structures and adaptations can occur and do occur due to genetic recombination. We don't have a problem with that. We see that today. That is observable. That we can see. And that's why it fits our model perfectly. Random mutations and natural selection, those occur. But these structures do not arise from the modification of similar structures of another kind of animal. In other words, the beak of a woodpecker, for example, did not arise from the beak of a dinosaur ancestor. It was the woodpecker, okay, which, by the way, was evolutionists teach. They believe that when you're eating a bird, you're eating a dinosaur. One even said that when you have Thanksgiving dinner, you can say, I'm having a dinosaur for dinner, because they believe that the birds came from dinosaurs, from reptiles. And so the beak of the woodpecker, they believe, would have come from a theropod dinosaur ancestor. It was rather, we believe, the Bible says it was originally designed structure. The beak was designed for the bird. It didn't come from a dinosaur. So the difference in beak shapes among woodpeckers now does fit within the idea of natural selection, leading to changes within the population of woodpeckers, because woodpeckers were a kind of bird. And personally, I don't have a problem with even woodpeckers coming from another kind of bird, but they're still birds. Birds have feathers. Birds have hollow wings, hollow bones. Birds have a special kind of a lung that is very unique from reptiles. Their feathers are extremely specified, a far leap from any kind of scale on a reptile. So,
I have a question along the lines of that, Jonathan.
Yeah.
If dinosaurs who are reptiles evolved into birds, are you saying that some of them evolved into birds and then did they leave some to evolve into reptiles?
Yeah.
Because I guess the bigger
Yeah.
question here too is that if reptiles evolved into birds, then why do we also still have reptiles?
Yeah, well, the theory of evolution is basically common ancestry. So you have an ancestor that gave birth to Archaeopteryx, which is the supposed missing link, and then there's also now Proavis, which is a supposed link, and that was just one branch of the tree. It was a small reptile that had some scales that gave it a little bit of aerodynamics, and so when it would jump out of a tree, it had a little more survival rate and didn't land so hard, and eventually the ones that had the bigger scales kept living, and then bigger scales, and then pretty soon the scales somehow developed into feathers over millions of years, and those then evolved into a bird. Somehow it had bird lungs, it had bird bones, all those internal processes also had to evolve at the same time, and voila, you have a flying dinosaur. And this is the kind of depths they'll go to. But again, where in the fossil record do we see a half bird, half reptile? Answer: none. Now they would say Archaeopteryx, which is basically a fully formed bird that happens to have claws on the end of its feet. That's it. And it has a raspy beak. It has kind of like a little teeth kind of on its beak. But it's a bird with feathers, has little hooks at the end of its wings, has claws, and a beak that has a little bit of kind of some little teeth. So there you have your missing.
So
link.
it has some like traits of a reptile, but it is still a bird.
Yeah.
I mean, but because to say that is like, because I have teeth and an ape has teeth, you can't draw the conclusion that we evolved just because we both have similar teeth or
Right.
similar jaw structures. We have a similar trait, but if we evolved, just saying that I have something similar does not mean that it is still a leap, you're saying, to jump into saying that similarities automatically points to evolution.
The creation model explains perfectly what we see in the similarity between, for example, we talked about humans and the apes. The creation model fits it perfectly because we believe in a common designer. It's a very important point. Make note of this. We believe in a common designer. The designer, the intelligent designer, God, demonstrates his design in that he created creatures with features that are similar. We don't deny that. Humans have similar hands to the ape. Humans walk upright. Some of the apes have partial upright walking. They look similar. There's arms and legs, and they walk a little bit. So there are features, but that's perfectly explainable because God, the designer, designed both the ape and the human. There's no problem there. This is one of the questions later on the professor points out is, well, how can we see DNA in all forms of life? DNA is a common thread which unites everything. Well, yes, because God made DNA as the source of information to code for the specific traits of each kind of living organism. So DNA really points to a common designer. It's the strongest argument for design.
What you're saying, just to clarify, what you're saying is that the reason why we have similarities is because we have the same creator.
Yeah.
And it's safe to say that he has a certain style or way of doing things that's going to show up in all of his creation, say a signature. But could it also be said too that apes, fish, dinosaurs, humans are all created to live in the same world? So since they're living on the same Earth, the same planet, sometimes they're going to require similarities because they have to deal with the same elements, water, land, breathing oxygen. They live in the same world, and they have the same limitations, and so they're going to have similarities because they have to be able to survive in the same area. So they have a common designer, who has a signature, and his glory shines and shows in what he designs. But also, we all have to function. Even though the ape functions in the jungle and I function here at home, the ape still has to breathe oxygen like I do. The ape still has to move around with gravity pulling on the ape just like it pulls on me. So it was created to live life more effectively in the jungle than I was, but it also has similarities because it has to be able to chew its food.
Right.
It has to be able to, same thing with the bird. The bird has lungs because it has to breathe the air like I do. But like the woodpecker, it has to get worms out of wood. It can't be doing that with a soft nose. So it's where we live obviously requires similar traits, and the common designer has common.
Right. He has given his creation the characteristics and the qualities and the features that are necessary to survive in this environment on planet Earth. And so that fits quite well with the model we see. I think it's also good to make a couple comments about evolution in general here. Mm-hmm. The definition of evolution that we have is, as you said, genetic change over time. But also, it can be said that evolution is all life on Earth coming about through descent, okay, with modification from a single common ancestor, and that is a hypothetical, primitive, single-celled organism. Mm-hmm. This is an amazing claim. Evolution is generally assumed to have happened as a natural consequence of natural selection, and no direct observational evidence supports this concept, okay? For example, no observational evidence supports this concept of a fish turning gradually into an amphibian. Now, evolutionists will argue that there has simply not been enough time to observe those changes, and man has only been recording information that would be useful for this in a short period of time, which is true. But this raises the question, is evolution a valid scientific idea, since it cannot be observed in experiments and repeated to show the conclusions that are valid? And of course, the fact that evolutionary processes on the scale of millions of years cannot be tested, cannot be observed, repeated, and falsified, which is really a professor's point that science has to be able to falsify. Evolution can't be falsified because no one was there to test it in its original environment. Therefore, is not science in the hard science definition. It really is what we call historical science. In secular science, evaluating historical events is considered just as acceptable as conducting laboratory experiments when it comes to making a scientific theory. But scientific theories are subject to change, and they would say it's acceptable to work within deficient framework until a better or more reasonable framework can be found. That's just the way they do science. They understand that, and they still are willing to accept the fact that they can't test repeat, and that's okay with them because that's all they have to work with. But a major problem, as I mentioned before, just kind of summing this up here, a major problem for evolution is the huge increase in information that is necessary for organisms to have over time greater and greater levels of DNA. And the theory of evolution accepts the additions and deletions of information as the evidence of a population and evolution occurring in a population. The problem is that though the imagined history of life on Earth, through that history, information content of the genomes of these organisms must have increased dramatically. Beginning with the most primitive form of life, we have a relatively simple genome compared to the genomes that we see today. Mutations are said to provide the fuel for this engine of evolution. Virtually all observed mutations result in a loss of information. And so
how could we be improving if we're constantly losing information?
Exactly. There would need to be some way to consistently add information to the genome to arrive, for example, dealing with plants, to arrive at a palm tree, and eventually people, from a single-cell organism. This is a hypothetical common ancestor of all life on Earth is a single-cell organism. So evolutionists have failed to answer the question, where did all the new information come from? Since mutations are known to reduce information, you cannot expect evolution, which requires a net gain information for millions of years, to occur as a result of mutations in natural selection.
So the bottom line here for this evidence claim is that anything that is considered evidence in the science world, depending upon interpretation, in a true science sense, points more towards a creator than a naturalistic process. And in reality, evolution is just lacking evidence all across the board based on the things that you've asserted, that it is not gaining information, it is losing information. There is nothing that we can observe, and science needs to be able to observe and test and have the possibility to disprove for it to be scientific.
Yeah.
So the evidence claim is really, you're saying, is a bit bold in that really there's not as much evidence as is claimed.
Right, but what you have, see, this is the thing, is the evolutionist response simply that there could be duplications of the entire genome, which will give extra DNA. Through mutation, you might make a double copy, and that would double the DNA, which we have seen is possible. It's possible, but I remember a debate one time at UC Davis. We had Philip Johnson from Berkeley. He wrote a book called Darwin on Trial. We had him come out. We had about 2,000 students come out to the auditorium. Granted, most of those probably were believing in creation, because there wasn't a whole lot of evolutionists that actually willing to show up. Because I was in the evolution department, I got to go door to door down the hall and invite the professors and ask them if they would tell their students, and they some of them told me I should go bury my head in the sand. But anyway, they did not respond too favorably. I remember one young man was talking at the microphone when Phil Johnson was speaking about the issue of information theory, the need for information to be produced, meaningful information. And the young man responded at the microphone in a very he was obviously agitated. He responded that, well, we have seen in some models that we can duplicate an entire genome. But the response, if I recall, was Dr. Philip Johnson was pointing out you have to have not just raw information, you need to have meaningful information. Information is not just, he used the illustration of turning on your printer and printing out just random pieces of information. That actually is not helpful. You need to have something that's meaningful, and that requires information. This is the whole point of information theory. So not just random base pairs for the for random DNA, but you need to have meaningful sentences, like the sentence, the quick brown fox jumped the fence. That's meaningful, but the same letters can be jumbled to mean nothing and would do nothing to help the organism. Information must be supplied from an intelligent design. There's no other model to explain that. The Christian or creationist model does perfectly do that.
So, and I'm glad you brought this up, because I remember hearing Professor John Lennox from Oxford. He's a colleague of Professor Richard Dawkins. And he was actually recalled a discussion that he had at some kind of a dinner with an evolutionist and an atheist. And I won't go through the whole story, but basically what he broke it down to say is, for example, Jonathan, you have a shirt on that says America needs Jesus. Now, science can tell me the chemical makeup of that ink. Science and maybe physics can tell me how the threads are holding the shirt together. Science can tell me, about the process of actually putting that on there. But science cannot explain to me why A means A, M means M, and why that word means America. Because going back to what we've touched on earlier, science, it's also important that science does not support evolution like is claimed, as you've asserted in many different areas. But also, science is not the final say-so in all things either. Science cannot, there are areas that we take as fact and that we accept, that science cannot prove, cannot even give any type of an explanation on. And I kind of want to bring this home to kind of wind down here. But I do want to end this by saying, and Jonathan, if you want to also share with this, is that, again, we do assert that we were created. And the most important part of that, and the whole purpose of this podcast, is that we were created. And our creation, man's creation, all history, comes together at the cross. That is where everything intersects, and that is the purpose of it all. We were created with a purpose. And I just want to end this by sharing that, and obviously, Jonathan, with that, is that above that we assert that we were created by God, God also sent his Son, and because of that, we have hope of eternal life. And that's what this is all about, because all of these things are attacks on that scripture, on that word, and an attack on that truth that affects all of us from the first man to the last man. The life of Christ affects us all. A gracious, merciful Creator is not only, people want to focus on the fearful side, but they also want to forget the merciful side of God, that He had mercy on us to sacrifice His Son and was pleased to crush Him for our transgressions. And I think that is important to reiterate and the note to end on. So
Absolutely.
John,
I just want to say regarding that, the whole creation is a picture of the love of God and the personal care and involvement God has with His creation. And when we throw this all out the window and call it the result of blind, random chaos, has no meaning. As a result, we throw away the message of God, the communication of God to us, that He cares about us, He loves us, He has a plan for our lives, like you said, Justin. And not only that, the whole creation culminates, as you said, with the cross. It culminates with God coming into the creation, as it were, becoming an ant, as it were, if you can imagine yourself becoming an ant, taking upon the very qualities of a human so He can be God and man, and in doing so, bridging the gap so that He could be a substitute. He could take upon Himself the sins of the people who would then believe upon Him and give their lives and receive Him as their personal Lord, as personal Master and Savior, and receive the forgiveness of sins. Creation is just the first of that. Creation is just the first demonstration of that. The incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ is the culmination of it all, and it's through that we can find freedom from ourselves, from our own philosophies, from our own man-made, naturalistic explanations, and be, and really, in words of Jesus, to be set free from the slavery to sin, and to come into a saving relationship with the God of the universe. What we've been talking about in this issue of the evidence for and against evolution, evidence for creation, and we've kind of mentioned here natural selection. We've talked about speciation, adaptation from what we believe is a more realistic and observable perspective, and what we see in science. I did want to mention a few other things about mutations and also about the fossil record before we finish here. The author Richard Dawkins, you may have heard of him. He's an avid atheist and evolutionist. Used the idea regarding mutations producing positive changes in living creatures, the idea of a blind watchmaker, to describe how genetics can create new features in organisms through evolutionary processes. And however, actual observations show that natural selection acts more like a blind gunman as mutations occur. And mutations occur when the genetic code of the DNA changes and come into different forms. And only the mutations in the germ cells, or the cells of egg and sperm, can be considered to be inherited in the next generation. So, in a large protein, for example, a mutation that at many positions in the gene may cause a defective protein to be formed. In one cholesterol disorder, for example, 350 disease-producing mutations have been documented to cause various problems with the cell membrane receptors in that particular disease. Another one, cystic fibrosis, is caused by a group of mutations as an ion pump in the cell membrane, and the protein consists of 1,480 amino acids, and the deletion of 3 bases at codon number 508 causes cystic fibrosis. And so what's interesting is nearly 200 other mutations have been shown to cause cystic fibrosis as well. Cancer is another disease that demonstrates the danger of mutations caused to organisms. And many times the germ cell, the germline mutations cause the cells to grow outside of the normal regulations, and this is what we see in cancer. Also sickle cell anemia. But what's interesting is whether it be cancer, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, if we start from the Bible, the effects of mutations and the continued decay of human genome is a clear example of the curse that resulted from Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden. The human genome will become increasingly corrupted as time passes. And that's what we expect, and that's in fact what we see. It's only until the return of Christ that when he conquers death and offers us the complete salvation from this present world and all that death and sin and disease, that we'll be free from these kinds of diseases and mutations. Now, the fact that change occurs, we don't deny. The most persuasive and dangerous definition for evolution is simply change through time. And just because organisms can be observed to change over a period of time does not mean that all life has a common ancestor. If we think of the classic peppered moth example, we start with light-colored moths and dark-colored moths. We ended up with a light-colored moth and the dark from the same species. This only exemplifies what creationists have always said. It's a variation within a kind. The natural selection that produces the variety of living things we see today began after Adam rebelled against God. The concept of natural selection was published in a biblical context by Edward Blythe, actually 24 years before Darwin published Origin of Species. Now, Blythe is forgotten and Darwin is remembered because of the philosophic and religious implications of his idea. But natural selection has been shown to change organisms, but always within the boundaries of the created kind. And this type of change is we call microevolution. And the hypothetical type of change that turns fish into philosophers, we would call that macroevolution. And the large-scale changes through time are simply dramatic extrapolations of the observed phenomenon of natural selection. So, as an illustration, if you take and you pedal a bicycle at 10 miles an hour, how long will it take you to reach the moon? Well, bicycles have limits that would make this goal impossible, regardless of the amount of time that you have to try to pedal to the moon. And that's what we see again with what we have in mutation. We see change, certainly, but not the kind of change that is necessary for evolution. I want to say a few words about the fossil record, because I know that's what evolutionists believe is evidence of transitions between species, and they believe it's a good argument. I would say just the opposite. The fossil record teaches us about evolution is that animals and plants appear very abruptly in the fossil record. Evolution would predict the fossils we find should be showing a vast array of transitional forms, but as we mentioned earlier, very few forms at all are found in transition. So the lack of order in the geologic layers presents another problem for evolution. And rather, the fossil record is much more consistent with the occurrence of a global flood and special creation than it is with evolutionary history. And one of the interesting things about that is throughout the fossil record, we find a lot of sea life mixed all through different strata. It's not a consistent pattern as you would, as is portrayed in the science books, but rather a mixture of a lot of different organisms that don't belong there. So I think it's helpful that we understand that the fossil record is not, in fact, the strongest argument for the evolutionists, but rather does point better to the model provided by the creationist. And did want to mention too, as we're reading these articles to you, I am taking a lot of my sources here from various different articles written from the ICR website and from Answers in Genesis. And so if you are interested in doing some of your own research on this, you can go and you can look at some of the websites I mentioned earlier for you, and you can find a lot of the articles that will explain some of these things in greater detail to you if you have further questions. So I just want to leave you with those thoughts.
I hope you enjoy this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.